in 1975, and he told me before the game that he was going to get 3 hits. He walked by me the first time going up to hit, and he said, "This is number 1." And he went up and boom, line drive. I just shook my head, and he get down to first.
Rod Carew was so good at hitting that pitchers would literally scream at him from the mound, begging him to change his stance. He made Nolan Ryan, the hardest thrower in baseball history, look average. He stole home 7 times in a single season, turning grown men into nervous wrecks every time he stepped on third base. He won 7 batting titles and finished with over 3,000 hits. And yet today, when people argue about the greatest hitters of all time, his name barely gets mentioned. The sport punished him for winning the wrong way. I am Mason, and this is Baseball Icons. Right now, if you scroll through any debate about the greatest hitters in baseball history, you will see the same names over and over. Mike Schmidt, Reggie Jackson, guys who hit home runs, guys who played in big markets, guys who fit the narrative that baseball wants to tell. Rod Carew does not fit that narrative. He played in Minnesota, he hit singles, he bunted, he stole bases, he made pitchers panic not by launching balls into the stands, but by making them feel like they had no control over what was about to happen. And for that, the sport has buried him. Before we go any further, do me a favor. Use the hype feature and hype this video. It helps more people see stories like this, stories the league does not want you to remember. Now let me show you why Carew was the most dangerous hitter pitchers ever faced, and why the sport refuses to admit it. The modern game has become obsessed with 3 specific outcomes: walk, strikeout, or home run. That is what teams build their entire strategies around now. Launch angle, exit velocity, spin rate. These are the numbers that matter. Contact hitting, the art of actually putting the bat on the ball and controlling where it goes, is treated like some outdated concept from a different sport. The game has decided that swinging for power and accepting strikeouts is better than making consistent contact, and that decision has fundamentally changed how we talk about greatness. If you do not hit 40 home runs, you are not elite. If you do not strike out 200 batters, you are not a true ace. The sport has built an entire value system around loud, dramatic moments. And Rod Carew was not loud. He was precise, he was surgical, he was deadly in ways that do not show up on highlight reels. And so the sport has decided his greatness does not count. But before we get into how the sport buried him, you need to understand what made Carew so terrifying for pitchers. Because this was not just about hitting for average. This was about psychological warfare. This was about turning the batter's box into a laboratory where Carew controlled every variable and pitchers had no answers. This was about a man who understood that baseball is a mental game first and a physical game second. And once you understand how his system worked, you will see why the sport's refusal to celebrate him is not just wrong, it is deliberate erasure. The problem starts with how baseball tells its own history. The sport loves to divide itself into neat little eras. There was the dead ball era, where guys bunted and stole bases and scraped together runs one at a time. Then Babe Ruth showed up and changed everything with the home run. Suddenly, the sport became about power. Fast forward to now, and the game is dominated by high-velocity pitching and the 3 true outcomes. Contact hitting has become a lost art. The sport does not value it anymore. And because the sport does not value it, the players who mastered it get forgotten. Carew had a lifetime average of 328. He collected 3,053 hits. He won 7 batting titles, a feat only a handful of players in history have ever matched. But none of that matters to the modern debate, because he only hit 92 home runs. And in the era of exit velocity and launch angle, 92 home runs means you do not get to sit at the big kids table. Let me be clear about something. Carew did not just hit for average. He weaponized the batter's box. While other guys showed up with one stance and hoped for the best, Carew had 7 different stances. 7. He would change his crouch mid-game, he would move his hands mid-count, he would shift his feet while the pitcher was winding up. Scouting reports became useless. Catchers had no idea what to call. Pitchers felt like they were throwing to a different batter every single pitch. And that was the point. Carew believed that if a pitcher could set up a hitter, then a hitter could set up a pitcher. So he built an entire system around making pitchers throw exactly where he wanted them to throw. This was not guesswork. This was science. And it worked against the best pitchers in the world. Here is how the system worked. When Carew wanted an inside pitch, he would lean his head and hands over the plate. He would close his front foot by a few inches. Every pitcher and catcher in the league knew what that meant. It meant he was vulnerable inside. It meant they could blow a fastball past him on the inner half of the plate, so they would throw it. And the moment the ball left the pitcher's hand, Carew would open his stance with his flexible front foot and turn on the ball with perfect timing. He baited them every single time. The beauty of this maneuver was its adaptability. If a smart pitcher figured out the trick and threw to the outside corner instead, Carew was ready for that too. His neutral starting position allowed him to swing away and drive the ball to the opposite field. There was no winning move for the pitcher. Either way, Carew had the answer. Catfish Hunter, one of the best pitchers of that era, said Carew had no holes. He meant it literally. There was no part of the strike zone you could exploit because Carew controlled which part you were allowed to attack. The stance system had variations for every situation. If he saw a sinking ball coming, he would drop into a deep crouch to flatten the visual plane and make the ball easier to track. Sinkers and low curveballs lose their movement when your eyes are level with the pitch. If he faced a high fastball, he would stand upright to force his swing to stay on top of the ball. If he needed to increase his bat speed against a power pitcher, he would drop his hands low to create more rotational speed. If he wanted a shorter path to a breaking ball, he would raise his hands high. He even had an open stance specifically designed for tracking screwballs and knuckleballs, pitches that move sideways at the last second. Every stance had a purpose. Every adjustment was calculated to give him an edge. And the best part was that he could switch between them during the at-bat. One pitch he would be crouched low, the next pitch he would be standing tall. Pitchers had no idea what they were facing from one moment to the next. This is where the psychological destruction really set in. Imagine you are a pitcher. You spend hours studying film. You memorize scouting reports. You know exactly where this guy is vulnerable. And then you get to the mound, and he changes his stance 3 times in one at bat. Everything you prepared for is now useless. You cannot exploit a weakness that keeps moving. You cannot set up a hitter who is setting you up. And worst of all, you know he is doing it on purpose. You know he is in your head, and there is nothing you can do about it. Nolan Ryan found this out the hard way. Ryan threw harder than anyone in the history of the sport. His fastball rose as it approached the plate, an optical illusion caused by pure velocity. Most hitters could not touch it. The ball looked like it was jumping out of their reach. But Carew batted .301 against Ryan over 109 plate appearances. In 1974, he hit .538 against him. .538 against the hardest thrower in baseball. That is not luck. That is domination. How did he do it? He crouched. Ryan's rising fastball was only rising because of the angle. When Carew dropped into an extreme crouch, he forced Ryan to bring the ball down into a flatter, more manageable plane. Suddenly, the ball that looked unhittable became a fastball in the zone. Ryan hated it. He would literally shout from the mound, telling Carew to stand up. Carew ignored him. Why would he give up an advantage? The chess match between them became legendary. Ryan had the power. Carew had the science. And science won. Ryan later admitted that Carew was the toughest out he ever faced. Not because Carew could overpower him, but because Carew could mess with his timing by changing his stance mid-count. Ryan would set up for one thing and Carew would show him something completely different. It drove Ryan crazy, and it worked. That is what made Carew so dangerous. He did not beat you with strength. He beat you with intelligence. He turned every at-bat into a mental battle that you were going to lose. But the stance system was only part of the equation. Carew also had vision that his teammates described as supernatural. Amos Otis, another great player from that era, said trying to sneak a pitch past Carew was like trying to sneak the sunrise past a rooster. He could identify the type of pitch, the spin, and the speed the moment it left the pitcher's fingers. While other hitters were guessing fastball or curveball, Carew was reading the rotation and knowing exactly what was coming, and he had a very strange way of making sure his vision stayed sharp. He would take Red Man tobacco and wrap it inside double mint gum. Then he would stuff the whole thing in his cheek, creating this massive bulge on one side of his face. His theory was that the bulge tightened the skin around his eye, preventing him from squinting or blinking when the pitch came in. Nobody has ever proven this works in a lab, but Carew swore by it. He said it kept his eyes wide open and locked on the ball. And given that he hit .328 over a 20-year career, it is hard to argue with the results. He also positioned himself as far back in the batter's box as the rules allowed. Most hitters stand closer to the pitcher because they think it gives them more time to react. Carew did the opposite. He wanted every extra inch of distance he could get because it gave him a fraction of a second longer to analyze the pitch. That fraction of a second was enough to tell the difference between a slider, a curveball, and a fastball. While other hitters were guessing, Carew was reading. And once he knew what was coming, he could adjust his swing to match. The combination of elite vision and the stance system made him nearly impossible to fool. Pitchers could not surprise him. They could not sneak anything past him. He saw everything, and he adjusted to everything. Then there were the bats. Carew treated his bats like they were living things. He could feel a difference of half an ounce. He could detect a change in handle thickness by a fraction of an inch. If a shipment of Louisville sluggers came in and the weight was off, he would send the entire batch back. He did not care if it delayed his preparation. The bat had to be perfect. The Minnesota Twins clubhouse staff knew how serious he was about this. They reserved a locked closet next to the sauna just for his bats. Carew believed the heat from the sauna baked out the bad wood and kept the ash hard and resilient. Wood contracts and expands with temperature and humidity. Carew thought that by storing his bats in consistent heat, he could maintain their structural integrity. Whether that actually worked or not, nobody knows. But Carew believed it, and that belief was part of his system. He also cleaned his bats with alcohol to remove pine tar buildup. Most players let pine tar cake up on the handle because it gives them better grip. Carew hated it. He said a dirty bat ruined his feel for the wood, and without that feel, he could not make the tiny mid-swing adjustments that separated a line drive from a weak grounder. Those adjustments happened in fractions of a second. The angle of the bat head, the rotation of his wrists, the pressure of his grip. All of it depended on tactile feedback from the wood. A dirty bat disrupted that feedback, so he cleaned them obsessively. He kept his bats in his private locker, away from the communal bins where teammates might accidentally bang them against the dugout steps. One bad collision could bruise the wood and change its density. Carew could feel that change, and he would not use a bruised bat. To him, the bat was not just a tool. It was his livelihood, the thing that separated him from everyone else, and he protected it like one. All of this, the stances, the vision, the bat rituals, it all fed into one goal: make the pitcher throw what you want, where you want, when you want. But Carew had another weapon in his arsenal that made him even more dangerous: the bunt. Most players use the bunt to sacrifice themselves and move a runner over. It is a giving up play. You trade an out for positional advantage. Carew did not see it that way. To him, the bunt was an offensive weapon, a way to torture defenses, a way to keep his average high even when pitchers were trying to pitch around him. He was the best bunter of his generation, maybe the best since Phil Rizzuto, and he practiced it with an intensity that bordered on obsession. During spring training, he would challenge his teammates to toss a sweater onto the infield. Then he would bunt balls directly into the sweater, over and over, no matter where they moved it. Dead center accuracy every time. He could drop a bunt 3 feet from the plate or 15 feet down the line, wherever the defense was weakest. That level of precision allowed him to place the ball in the dead zones of the infield, areas where even the fastest third baseman or pitcher could not make a play. And because he could bunt with such control, defenses had to respect it. They had to play in, and when they played in, it opened up lanes for his line drives. The bunt served 3 critical purposes for Carew. First, it countered the shift. When teams started moving their fielders to take away his hitting lanes, he would just bunt down the vacated line. The third baseman would be playing near second base. Carew would drop a bunt toward third. By the time anyone got to it, he was on first. The defense would have to reset to a normal alignment for his next at bat, which opened up the field for his singles and doubles. Second, the bunt broke slumps. Carew believed that if his timing was off, he could recalibrate by focusing on the small, precise movement of a bunt. It was a surefire method, he said, to get his vision and mechanics back in sync. The bunt required perfect hand-eye coordination and total focus. By stripping the swing down to its most basic form, Carew could reset his muscle memory and timing. Third, the bunt created chaos. The constant threat of a bunt forced infielders to play closer to the plate. That widened the gaps. It also put pressure on the pitcher to field his position, which most pitchers are not good at. If the pitcher had to worry about covering first on a bunt, he could not focus entirely on the hitter. Carew used that distraction to his advantage. Billy Martin, his manager during the most aggressive years, once said Carew could bunt 330 if he tried. That was not a joke. It was a recognition that Carew's bunting was not a sacrifice. It was a high-percentage offensive play that kept his average high and made pitchers second-guess every single pitch. Should they pitch him away to prevent a pull hit? Then he bunts down the line. Should they pitch him inside to jam him? Then he turns on it. Should they throw breaking balls to keep him off balance? Then he waits and drives it the other way. There was no right answer. Every choice the pitcher made opened up another option for Carew, and that is what made him unstoppable. But the most terrifying thing Carew did had nothing to do with his bat. It was what he did on the base paths. In 1969, under Billy Martin's direction, Carew stole home 7 times. 7 in one season. That tied the major league record. And it was not just about the runs he scored. It was about the psychological destruction he caused. Every time Carew reached third base, the entire dynamic of the game changed. Pitchers panicked. Opposing dugouts would scream, "Hold him on, watch him." The pitcher would lose focus on the batter. They would abandon their natural windup and switch to the stretch, which weakened their delivery. The whole rhythm of the game would collapse. And Carew knew it. That was the point. He was not just trying to score, he was trying to break the pitcher's concentration, and it worked every single time. The secret to his success was something called the walking lead. Most runners take a lead and then stop in a set position. They wait for the pitcher to commit, and then they break for the next base. Martin told Carew to do something different. Keep moving. Slow, constant momentum toward home plate. No stopping, no waiting. The moment the pitcher started his windup, Carew was already in motion. He was not reacting to the pitch. He was forcing the pitcher to react to him, and that changes everything. When a runner is stationary, the pitcher has time to adjust. When a runner is moving, the pitcher has to rush. And rushed pitchers make mistakes. Carew and Martin timed opposing pitchers down to the split second. They would sit in the dugout with a stopwatch, counting the beats from the start of the windup to the release of the ball. If a pitcher used a full windup and took about 6 beats, Carew would be safe. If the pitcher used a stretch and took 4 beats, Carew would stay put. It was a mathematical exercise. There was no guessing. They knew exactly which pitchers were vulnerable and which ones were not, and they exploited that knowledge ruthlessly. The batter also played a role. He was trained to stand in a way that obscured the catcher's vision without being called for interference. The rules say a batter cannot deliberately block the catcher, but if the batter just happens to be in his normal stance and the catcher's view is blocked, that is legal. So the batter would stand tall, keep his bat up, and make it as hard as possible for the catcher to see Carew barreling toward the plate. By the time the catcher realized what was happening, it was too late. On April 9th, Carew timed Roger Nelson's long windmill windup and stole home in the 5th inning. Nelson had one of the slowest deliveries in the league. Carew and Martin knew it. They waited for the right moment, and when it came, Carew was gone. On April 19, he did it again against Hoyt Wilhelm's slow knuckleball. Wilhelm was a future Hall of Famer, one of the craftiest pitchers in the game, but his knuckleball took so long to reach the plate that Carew had time to walk home. Harmon Killebrew, the batter, had to hold his swing at the last second to avoid hitting Carew. By the end of April, he had 3 steals of home. By June, he had 6, tying Ty Cobb's long-standing American League record. On July 16th, he stole home for the 7th time against Jerry Nyman of the Chicago White Sox, tying Pete Reiser's Major League record. The entire American League was in chaos. Pitchers did not know what to do. Every time Carew got to third, the game stopped being about the batter and became about stopping Carew, and most of the time, they could not. The impact of this went far beyond the 7 runs he scored. By the middle of the 1969 season, Carew's presence on third base had become a debilitating distraction for pitchers. Opposing dugouts would lose their minds. Coaches would scream instructions. Teammates would yell warnings. The catcher would be signaling frantically, and the pitcher, who was supposed to be focused on getting the batter out, was instead thinking about the guy on third. Pitchers were forced to abandon their natural windups whenever Carew reached third. That meant less velocity, less movement, less deception. It weakened their entire arsenal, and it increased the likelihood that they would make a mistake to the hitter. Carew was not just stealing bases, he was breaking down the opposition's entire defensive structure, one man causing system-wide collapse. His quest for a record-breaking 8th steal ended in controversy. Against the Seattle Pilots, Carew tried to steal home against Skip Lockwood. He looked safe. Everyone in the stadium thought he was safe, but the umpire, Jim Honachik, had been knocked over by the slide and called him out from the ground. Carew and Billy Martin were both ejected. Martin went berserk, screaming at the umpire, getting in his face, nearly getting suspended. The intensity of that moment showed just how high the stakes were. This was not just about a record. This was about sending a message. This was about proving that speed and timing could be just as valuable as power. Later in the season, Tommy John, one of the smartest pitchers in the league, finally caught Carew trying to steal home. John anticipated the attempt, quickened his delivery, and got the ball to the catcher in time. But by then, the damage was done. 1969 became the year that pitchers learned to fear Carew on third base as much as they feared him in the batter's box. And then there was Gaylord Perry. Perry was a notorious spitball artist, a guy who used illegal grease and saliva to make the ball move in ways that broke the laws of physics. He would load up the ball with Vaseline or KY jelly or whatever else he could hide on his uniform. The ball would dart and dip unpredictably. Batters hated facing him because you could not prepare for a pitch that moved differently every time. But Perry himself admitted that Carew was the only hitter who could consistently pick out the dry side of his grease balls and punish them. Carew had figured out that Perry's illegal pitches had one clean side and one greased side. If you could identify which side was dry, you could predict which way the ball would break. And Carew could see it. He could see the shine of the grease, he could see the asymmetry of the spin, and he could adjust his swing accordingly. It drove Perry crazy. On May 14, 1975, things got personal. In the first inning, Carew stole home while Perry was pitching from the windup. Perry saw it as a direct humiliation. Stealing home is already disrespectful. Doing it in the first inning when the game is still close and the stakes are high is even worse. Doing it to a proud veteran like Perry was crossing a line. So in Carew's next at-bat, Perry retaliated with chin music. A high, tight fastball aimed directly at Carew's head. This was not a mistake. This was intentional. Perry was sending a message. You embarrassed me, so now I am going to scare you. Carew did not take it well. On the next pitch, he let his bat fly toward Perry on the mound. The bat went spinning through the air, nearly hitting Perry. It was dangerous. It was deliberate, and it was a clear violation of the unwritten rules of baseball. The umpire, Nestor Chilak, stepped in immediately. He asked Carew if the bat was slippery. It was a softball question, an easy way for Carew to defuse the situation. He could have said yes, the bat slipped. Sorry about that. But Carew did not play that game. Instead, he delivered one of the most legendary retorts in baseball history. Did you ask Gaylord if the ball was slippery? It was a double-edged jab. It called out the brush back pitch and Perry's illegal grease at the same time. The whole stadium knew what Carew meant. Perry had broken the code by throwing at his head. Carew had responded by breaking the code right back. And then he threw Perry's cheating right in his face in front of an umpire, knowing there was nothing Perry could say without admitting he was doctoring the ball. It was a masterclass in psychological warfare, and it highlighted something something important. Carew was one of the most composed players in baseball. He rarely lost his cool. He rarely showed emotion, but when he did, it was devastating. So let me put all of this together. Carew had 7 different stances that he could switch between at will, making scouting reports useless. He had vision so sharp that teammates compared him to a rooster watching the sunrise. He used tobacco and gum to tighten the skin around his eyes and prevent blinking. He stored his bats in a locked sauna closet and could feel the difference of half an ounce. He cleaned them with alcohol to maintain tactile feedback. He could bunt with dead center accuracy into a sweater lying on the infield. He used the bunt to counter defensive shifts, break slumps, and create chaos. He stole home 7 times in one season, using a walking lead that turned pitchers into nervous wrecks. He timed pitchers to the split second and exploited their vulnerabilities with mathematical precision. He baited pitchers into throwing where he wanted, and then punished them for it. He made Nolan Ryan, the hardest thrower in history, shouted him from the mound in frustration. He humiliated Gaylord Perry so badly that Perry threw at his head, and then Carew threw his cheating right back in his face. And through it all, he maintained a .328 lifetime average, won 7 batting titles, and collected 3,053 hits. And yet, when people talk about the greatest hitters in baseball history, Carew gets left out. His name does not come up. He does not make the top 10 lists. He does not get the documentaries. He does not get the endless analysis and debate. Why? Because he played in Minnesota, a small market that did not get the media coverage of New York or Los Angeles during the 1960s and 70s. Because he hit singles instead of home runs. Because he only hit 92 home runs in his entire career, and the sport decided that power is the only thing that matters. Because he started as a second baseman and then moved to first base, and some analysts say that made him less valuable. The sport built a narrative around what a great hitter is supposed to look like. Big market, big power, big moments. And Carew did not fit, so they buried him. But here's the thing the sport does not want to admit. Carew was a proto-Ichiro. He was a player whose value came from high-volume contact and base path pressure. He proved that you did not need to hit home runs to dominate. You just needed to be smarter than everyone else. His 1977 season remains one of the greatest offensive campaigns in history. He hit .388 that year and chased .400 for most of the season. The whole country was watching. Every at-bat was on the news. People who did not even follow baseball knew about Rod Carew's chase for .400. It captivated the baseball world, and it proved that contact hitting could still be a dominant force in the live ball era. But the sport has conveniently forgotten that. Because if they admitted Carew was one of the best, they would have to admit that their obsession with home runs and velocity and the 3 true outcomes is missing the point. Let me compare Carew to some of the other great contact hitters. Tony Gwynn hit .338 with 3,141 hits and won 8 batting titles. Ted Williams hit .344 with 2,654 hits and won 2 Triple Crowns. Wade Boggs hit .328 with 3,010 hits and won 5 batting titles. Carew hit .328 with 3,053 hits and won 7 batting titles. He is right there with them. His numbers match up, his accomplishments match up, and yet Gwynn gets celebrated as the greatest pure hitter of his generation. Williams gets celebrated as the greatest hitter who ever lived. Boggs gets celebrated as a hitting machine, and Carew gets footnotes. He gets mentioned in passing. He gets the occasional acknowledgement, but he does not get the reverence. Why? Because the sport has decided that his style of hitting, the bunting, the base running, the stance changes, the psychological warfare does not fit the modern idea of greatness. They want highlight reel home runs. They want guys who crush balls 400 feet. They want exit velocity stats and launch angle charts. They do not want a guy who made pitchers feel helpless by doing 1,000 small things perfectly. And that is what makes Carew so dangerous to the narrative. He was not flashy. He did not give you the moments that make SportsCenter. He gave you 7 innings of absolute control. He gave you at-bats where the pitcher knew they were being outsmarted and could not do anything about it. He gave you chaos on the base paths that made entire defenses collapse. He gave you a bunt that was more effective than most players' swings. He gave you a chess match where he was always 3 moves ahead. And the sport could not market that, so they buried it. Think about what the GOAT debate has become. It is a popularity contest. It is about who played in the biggest market, who hit the most home runs, who fits the narrative that baseball wants to sell. It is not about who was actually the best at hitting a baseball. Because if it was about that, Carew would be in every conversation. 7 batting titles, 3,000 hits, a .328 average over 20 years. The ability to change stances mid-count and make Nolan Ryan look ordinary. The ability to bunt for a higher average than most guys could swing for. The ability to steal home 7 times in a season and turn pitchers into paranoid messes. That is greatness. But it is quiet greatness, and quiet does not sell. The sport rewards what is loud, home runs are loud, strikeouts are loud, velocity is loud. A guy who stands in the box, shifts his feet, and slaps a single to right field is not loud, but it is deadly. And that is what Carew was, deadly. He destroyed pitchers. He made Hall of Fame pitchers look like they had no idea what they were doing. He turned the batter's box into a laboratory and the base paths into a war war zone, and the sport punished him for it by pretending none of it mattered, by building a value system that excluded him, by celebrating the guys who hit home runs and ignoring the guy who hit 328 by outsmarting everyone. The sport did not just bury Carew's legacy, it buried it deliberately, because admitting that Carew was one of the best would mean admitting that the modern game has lost something important. It would mean admitting that contact hitting and base running and psychological warfare are just as valuable as power. And the sport cannot admit that, because the whole business model is built on home runs now. The whole product is built on loud moments. And Carew was not loud. You know what the worst part is? Carew is still alive. He is still here. And he has to watch as the sport he dominated talks about Mike Schmidt and Reggie Jackson and guys who hit home runs while his name gets left out. He has to listen to debates about the greatest hitters where people act like he does not exist. He has to see younger fans scroll past his stats because they do not look impressive in an era obsessed with launch angle and exit velocity. The sport did not just bury his legacy, it buried it while he was still around to see it happen. And that is cruel. That is the sport saying, we do not care what you did. We do not care how good you were. You do not fit our narrative, so you do not matter. The stance system alone should be enough to put him in the conversation. Nobody else in the history of baseball has ever used 7 different stances as a tactical weapon. Nobody else has ever changed their crouch mid-count to manipulate where the pitcher throws. Nobody else has turned the batter's box into a psychological experiment where the pitcher is the subject and Carew is the scientist. He did that, and it worked for 20 years against the best pitchers in the world. That is not a gimmick. That is mastery. The bunting should be enough. Nobody else could drop a bunt into a sweater with dead center accuracy. Nobody else used the bunt as an offensive weapon that kept their average above 320. Nobody else made defenses panic just because they might bunt. Billy Martin said Carew could bunt 330 if he tried. That means the bunt was not a last resort. It was a legitimate offensive strategy that was statistically better than most players' full swings. That is absurd. And yet the sport treats it like it does not matter. The base running should be enough. Nobody else stole home 7 times in one season using a walking lead that destroyed pitchers' concentration. Nobody else made entire dugouts scream in panic every time they reached third base. Nobody else forced pitchers to abandon their windups and weaken their deliveries just by standing on third. That is not just base running. That is systemic disruption. That is one player causing the entire opposition to malfunction. And the sport acts like it was just a fun little trick. The vision should be enough. Nobody else could identify a pitch the moment it left the pitcher's hand with such accuracy that teammates compared it to a rooster seeing the sunrise. Nobody else used tobacco and gum to prevent blinking. Nobody else stood as far back in the box as possible just to get a fraction of a second more to read the spin. That level of preparation and attention to detail is what separates greatness from mediocrity, and the sport ignores it. Any one of those things would make a player special. Carew had all of them, and the sport still found a way to bury him because he did not fit the mold, because he played in Minnesota, because he did not hit home runs, because the sport decided that greatness has to look a certain way and Carew did not look like that. So they moved on. They found new heroes. They built new narratives, and they left Carew behind. But the numbers do not lie. 3,053 hits, 7 batting titles, a 328 lifetime average, a 538 average against Nolan Ryan in 1974, a 388 season in 1977, 7 steals of home in 1969. Those are not just good numbers. Those are all-time great numbers. Those are numbers that put you in the conversation for the best hitter ever. And yet the conversation happens without him. So what does that tell you? It tells you that the GOAT debate is broken. It tells you that the sport cares more about style than substance. It tells you that playing in a small market can destroy your legacy no matter how good you are. It tells you that the sport will rewrite history to fit whatever narrative it wants to sell. And right now, it wants to sell home runs. It wants to sell power. It wants to sell the 3 true outcomes. It does not want to sell a guy who made pitchers feel helpless by doing 1,000 small things perfectly, because that does not fit on a highlight reel. That does not translate to a 30-second clip. That requires you to watch an entire at-bat, an entire game, an entire season to understand what made Carew great. And the sport does not have the patience for that anymore. Here's what Carew represents. He represents the idea that baseball is a thinking man's game, that it is not just about who can hit the ball the hardest or throw the ball the fastest. It is about who can outsmart the other guy, who can adapt, who can read the situation and make the perfect adjustment. Carew did that better than anyone. He turned hitting into a science. He turned the batter's box into a chessboard. He turned the base paths into a weapon. And he did it all with the quiet confidence of a guy who knew he was better than you and did not need to prove it with a home run. But the sport does not want that story anymore. The sport wants loud. It wants flash. It wants moments that go viral. It wants exit velocity stats and launch angle charts. It wants something it can package and sell to casual fans who do not understand the nuance of the game. And Carew does not give them them that. Carew gives them mastery, and mastery is boring to people who do not understand what they are watching. So they buried him. They took one of the greatest hitters in the history of baseball and turned him into a footnote. They took a guy who made Hall of Fame pitchers look like they had no idea what they were doing and pretended he was just another good player. They took 7 batting titles and 3,000 hits and a 328 average and said, yeah, but he did not hit enough home runs. And now, when younger fans look back at the history of the sport, they do not even know who Rod Carew is, because the sport made sure of it. But here's the thing. The truth does not go away just because the sport ignores it. Carew was a nightmare for pitchers. He was the guy they could not solve. He was the at-bat they dreaded. He was the runner on third that made them lose focus. He was the bunt they could not defend. He was the stance they could not prepare for. He was the vision they could not fool. And no amount of revisionist history changes that. The pitchers who faced him know. The teammates who played with him know. The fans who watched him know. He was one of the best, and the sport buried him anyway. So the next time someone tries to tell you that the GOAT debate is about who was the best, remember Rod Carew. Remember that greatness does not always look the way the sport wants it to look. Remember that sometimes the quietest player in the room is the most dangerous. Remember that a guy who hit singles can be more valuable than a guy who hit home runs. Remember that the sport will bury anyone who does not fit the narrative. And remember that Rod Carew did not need the sport's approval. He had the respect of every pitcher who ever faced him, and that is worth more than any debate. Carew was not a highlight reel. He was not a home run god. He was something worse for pitchers. He was a problem they could not solve, a puzzle with no answer, a nightmare that lasted 20 years, and the sport punished him for winning the wrong way. But the pitchers remember. They remember the crouch. They remember the bunt. They remember the steal of home. They remember the moment they realized they had no idea how to get him out. And that memory is Carew's real legacy. Not the titles, not the stats, not the debates. The fear, the respect, the knowledge that when Rod Carew stepped into the box, you were about to get outsmarted, and there was nothing you could do about it. That is greatness, and no amount of burial can change it. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of baseball's most underrated legends, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment telling me whether you think Carew gets buried in the GOAT debate and why the sport refuses to give him credit. Because this story matters, and the more people who know it, the harder it is for the sport to keep pretending it did not happen.